Okay, as I was just mentioning, what we're going to do today is to look at what happens at the top of Mount Sinai. All of this in preparation really for next week. That is the end of next week, which will be the holiday of Shavuot. And I want to think about that holiday, which really celebrates the giving of the Torah. Now, it's worth mentioning that, and I went into this a little bit last week when I was asked about it. I think Saul asked me why Shavuot commemorates the giving of the Torah, because if you look at the description of Shavuot in the Torah itself, it says nothing about the giving of the Torah. It just says that after Passover, you should count 7 weeks. And at the end, and that's why Shavuot is called Shavuot. Shavuot means weeks, right? Count 7 weeks. And at the conclusion of that 7-week counting, you will have a holiday. And that holiday is described agriculturally. Right? It'll be a harvest holiday, one of 3 in the year. And it doesn't in the Torah have any historical connection. Unlike Passover, unlike Sukkot, the other 2 harvest festivals, there isn't a connection. It is the rabbis who find or create, depending on how you want to look at it, that connection. They tie it to the giving of the Torah on Mount Sinai, which in many ways, after the creation, is for them the most significant, or I guess there are 3 most significant events in history. From the rabbinic point of view, they are creation, redemption, revelation, right? The creation of the world, the redemption from Egypt, and then the revelation on Mount Sinai. And so we're going to look at that revelation. And we're going to look at it in 2 places. We'll start in the book of Exodus. Then we'll see Moses's description of the same thing in the book of Deuteronomy. And even there, we're going to jump around a little bit. But I want to start on page, if you have the Eitz Chaim, page 438. We're going to begin with verse 7. And that is on page 438, and it's chapter 19 of the book of Exodus, chapter 19, and we're going to begin with verse 7. So give you a second to find it. Page 438, chapter 19, verse 7 of the book of Exodus. So Moses came and summoned the elders of the people and put before them all that the Lord had commanded him. And the people answered as one, saying, all that the Lord has spoken, we will do. Right? There are a variety of formulations of this. Perhaps the best one is na'aseh v'nishma. We will do and we will hearken, or we will do and we will understand. And I want you to bear that in mind, because we will come back to it when we look a little bit at the Midrash. Moses brings the people's words to God. God says to Moses, I will come to you in a thick cloud in order that the people may hear when I speak with you and trust you ever after, right? So God is announcing that part of this is validating Moses's role. And the point here is God will be clothed, as it were, in this cloud. See, all of Mount Sinai is going to be covered with this thick cloud. And what that means is nobody other than Moses can really see what's going on up there. Right? I want to emphasize that because that's what opens the way up, in part, for the rabbinic speculation that we're going to look at very quickly. Okay, so Moses reports the people's words to the Lord, and the Lord said to Moses, go to the people, warn them to stay pure today and tomorrow. Let them wash their clothes. Let them be ready for the third day. On the third day, the Lord will come down in the sight of the people on Mount Sinai, right? So the people are going to see God coming down here, although it's not clear how that will be. And in fact, as when we look at Deuteronomy, we'll see a tremendous emphasis on the fact that they did not see. Right? But here it seems to suggest perhaps they will see God coming down. And therefore, you should set bounds for the people round about, saying, beware of going up to the mountain or touching the border of it. Whoever touches the mountain will be put to death. No hand shall touch him. He will be stoned or shot, beast or man, he will not live. Right? There's a very, very strong warning with consequences not to go near the mountain. But when the ram's horn sounds a loud blast, they can go to the mountain, right? And as we're going to see in a minute, this is because it's quite dangerous. They don't want, God doesn't want the people coming near the mountain. They won't, other than Moses and Aaron, who's kind of on the way up, they're not really going to be able to stand this experience or withstand it. Moses comes down from the mountain to the people, warns them to stay pure. They wash their hands. And Moses says, be ready for the third day. Don't go near or grow close to, maybe even touch a woman. So this is, of course, a troubling passage because you might read this as thinking that somehow women would contaminate if they want to maintain themselves in a state of purity, then going near a woman would contaminate them. I think the idea here is not proximity so much as actually intimacy, sleeping together, because throughout there are two things in the Torah and in the rabbinic tradition that cause uncleanliness. One is blood, and the other is bodily fluids, and in this case, sperm. So the idea is God is going to come down. This place needs to be its sanctity, its purity, and in very technical cultic terms, needs to be preserved. So now it's the third day. Morning dawns, there's thunder and lightning and a dense cloud that comes upon the mountain and a very loud blast of the shofar. And all the people who are in the camp tremble, right? So this is real pyrotechnics. There are some people who want to equate this to a kind of volcanic eruption, right? Fire and smoke and loud noises, but there is no sense of lava flow here. It's very hard to imagine Moses going up and withstanding that. But as a metaphor for what's going on, it's a pretty good metaphor. And I want to take note of the fact that it says the people are trembling. And if you look at the Hebrew, kol shofar chazak ma'od, the sound of the shofar is extremely strong. V'yecherad kol ha'am, and the people are trembling. So the word trembling, yecherad, you might recognize through a very similar modern Hebrew word, which is well known in English also, Haredim, right? The Haredim are what we sometimes call ultra-Orthodox Jews. And more commonly these days, and increasingly, they're called Haredim, and that's what they call themselves. They don't call themselves ultra-Orthodox, they call themselves Haredim, right? And this idea that you are, you are trembling, right, is this sense of awe as you come close to the experience of God. And that is, right, a very positive kind of way of putting this, right, that you're trembling. There's another religious tradition which also picks up on this, and that is the Quakers, right? Quaking is like trembling, right? And I don't know that they get that from this text. They may or may not get it from this text, but it's similar. This is a religious experience, right? The people, and we're going to see actually how extraordinary this experience is. Okay, so Moses leads the people out of the camp towards God, and they take their places at the foot of the mountain. B'tachtit hachar, and in the text in Deuteronomy that we're going to look at, it's tachat hachar, right? Literally beneath the mountain. And I'll come back to that as well. Mount Sinai is all in smoke, for the Lord had come down on it in fire. The smoke rose like the smoke of a kiln, and the whole mountain trembles violently, right? So here, it's not just the people who are trembling. Mount Sinai itself is trembling. What we're seeing here is this extraordinary event where somehow God is actually becoming present, at least according to the account here in Exodus, in the world. And there is one other way in the book of Exodus that God is present, and that, of course, is in the tabernacle, in the Mishkan. And a lot of people, modern scholars in particular, have referred to the Mishkan that travels with the people through the wilderness as a portable Sinai, in the sense that God there is present in an almost physical way, right? Now, this also suggests that where God is not in heaven, as it were, in this text, right? God has come down to meet with Moses at the top of Mount Sinai. That God is, as it were, if we can speak about God in those terms, physically present there. But the whole thing, it's impossible to know what that looks like because we have all these clouds and pyrotechnics. The blare of the horn grows louder and louder. As Moses spoke, God answers in thunder. The Lord came down on Mount Sinai on the top of the mountain and calls Moses up to the mountain, and Moses went up. And then God sends him back down again. Go down, warn the people not to break through to the Lord to gaze, lest many of them perish. The priests also who come near the Lord must stay pure, lest the Lord break out against them. Moses said, however, the people cannot come up, for you warned us, saying, set bounds. And the Lord says, go down and come back together with Aaron, but not let the priests or the people break through. And Moses went to the people and spoke to them. All right, so that is the introduction to what God, the content of God's speech, right? Which we often call the Ten Commandments. So that's the scene. I want to turn to page 449 now, verse 15. And this is 2015. This is now right after the Ten Commandments. all the people witnessed the thunder and lightning, the blare of the horn, and the mountain smoking, and the people saw it, and they fell back and stood at a distance. What I want to point out here is in the Hebrew, Kol ha'am ro'im et hakolot. The whole people, literally, it says witnessed, but if you look at the literal language of the Torah, they saw it. They saw the sounds, right? Ro'im et hakolot. They saw the thunder, right? And I think here, this isn't just a kind of figure of speech. The idea here is that they are having such an overwhelming experience that it scrambles their senses. Right? They see that which we ordinarily hear. And they also, so that they have seen the thunder, lightning. They've heard the blare of the horns and the mountain smoking. And they say to Moses, you speak to us and we will obey, but let not God speak to us lest we die. So did God just speak to them with the 10 commandments or not? Because here the people are saying, no, don't let God speak to us, right? And I want you to sort of bracket that as well, because we're going to come back to it and think about how it is that the rabbis will create out of this some midrash. We're going to go on in a minute to look at the book of Deuteronomy and see the same scene, but described just a little bit differently. Before we do, I'm opening it up. And if anyone has a question up to this point about how the revelation is described, let's take a minute. So, any questions at all? Yeah, Saul.
Yeah, I just want to mention the word Bayecharad with the word Haredim. You have a group in the Midwest called the Shakers. They're related to the Amish, I believe. So that name probably comes from that word.
Yes. As I mentioned, the Quakers, there's also the Shakers, right? These shake, and it's all the same, right? This idea is kind of to feel like you are constantly in the presence of God. Soren Kierkegaard, fear and trembling, right? A similar kind of an idea, right? That the experience of God, is not a casual one. It's not just, and by the way, I think this runs counter to this sort of modern conception of God as this kind of, not just loving, but sort of accessible, user-friendly kind of a God, right? The God here is an awesome power that shakes you. Marilyn.
Does God speak in Hebrew?
So since the people speak Hebrew, they hear Hebrew. Now, I'm emphasizing that rather than to say that God speaks in Hebrew, because we have a variety of traditions that essentially says God speaks God's language, and it's heard by the people in the language that they speak. You see this idea. There are two versions of the 10 Commandments, one here in Exodus and the other in Deuteronomy. And the language between them is slightly different, right? So one says, Shamor et Yom HaShabbat, right, keep the Sabbath. And the other says, Zachor et Yom HaShabbat, right? Remember the Sabbath, right? Observe it and also honor it, you could say, a variety of different ways to interpret it. But how could we have, if this is God really speaking, you would say, well, either Moses didn't remember it correctly, right? Or, right, there seems to be some contradiction here. Which did God really say? So if you know the text, the Friday night liturgy, and you know Lecha Dodi, right, which is that hymn we sing that everybody knows, it begins Shamor v'zachor b'dibor echad, right? Remember and keep in one word, right? That verse of Lecha Dodi is actually an attempt to deal with the contradiction in language between Exodus and Deuteronomy. And what it's saying essentially is God gave a single utterance that somehow contained within it both of these words, right? And that suggests, I think, that midrashic tradition, which is being captured in Lecha Dodi, is that God speaks God talk. And it's heard in people according to their own understanding or language or way of thinking. Okay, it's a great question. Thank you for it. Anything else before we go on to Deuteronomy? Sandy.
So Rabbi, the voice of a horn, is that supposed to be, I think you said a shofar, but I mean, is someone blowing it, or is God
Right,
involved in
right.
that?
So the idea is it's not being blown. It's simply accompanying this theophany on Mount Sinai. That's what they hear. There isn't a sense of, and in fact, when someone blows the shofar, here, it seems to be getting louder and louder. Right? I mean, I've heard great shofar blowers, right, on Rosh Hashanah, but eventually it peters out, right? It certainly doesn't get louder and louder, right? So I don't think it's literally a ram's horn. It is the sound of a shofar, right? And again, what we're thinking about here is something quite supernatural, right? By definition, God does not somehow incarnate here at the top of a mountain in ordinary human experience. And so they're trembling and they're hearing things and they're seeing thunder, right? I mean, this is really a tremendously mystical experience that the entire people is having. Okay, let's jump ahead. Let me come back to the other view. We're going to jump ahead. I want you to turn to the first text we'll look at is on page 1009. 1009, and it's in Deuteronomy, and it is 1009, and it's verse 10. And here, it is Deuteronomy chapter 4, at the very top of the page, chapter 4, verse 10. So just to remind you, Deuteronomy is Moses's recapitulation of what essentially the earlier generation has experienced, right? Moses is going to die. The book of Deuteronomy is his farewell speech. It's very long, right? It's poetic in its language. And it begins with him reminding them or telling them about the giving of the Torah on Mount Sinai, about what happened when the scouts were sent into the land, which we saw in the book of Numbers, and a variety of other things. Not, of course, the entire history, not the whole book of Exodus. It also contains some new laws and other things. Okay, so it's in the context of Moses's recapitulation here that we find this. Verse 10. The day you stood before the Lord your God at Horeb. Horeb is another name that the Torah uses for Mount Sinai. when the Lord said to me, gather the people to me that I may let them hear my words in order that they may learn to revere me as long as they live on earth, and may so teach their children. Now, one significant difference, though it doesn't interest us today, is that in Exodus, it was essentially so they should revere Moses. That was the purpose of the theology, right? At least in part. There's no mention of that here. And if Moses is telling the story, it's perhaps not surprising. You came forward, stood at the foot of the mountain, and that's verse 11, and ta'amodun tachat hachar, beneath the mountain. The mountain was ablaze with flames to the very skies, dark and dense as clouds. The Lord spoke to you out of the fire. You heard the words, but perceived no shape, nothing but voice, right? So here, the emphasis is that God is speaking to the people from the mountain. But we are told that the mountain is dark and dense. What we're not told in the book of Deuteronomy is that God came down. They hear, there are some pyrotechnics. They hear God's voice. In the book of Deuteronomy, God does not seem to leave God's heavenly abode. God speaks to the people through Sinai, and you could even say that God's words create the pyrotechnics. But here the emphasis is nothing but a voice. He declared the covenant that he had commanded you to observe, the 10 commandments, inscribing them on 2 tablets of stone. And at the same time, the Lord commanded me to impart to you laws and rules for you to observe in the land you're about to be crossed into. For your own sake, be most careful. You saw no shape of the Lord when God spoke to you out of Horeb, and therefore don't make idols, right, or images. I want you to turn now to page 1016. We're now at chapter 5. And we're going to look at verse 2, 16 verse 2. It's chapter 5, verse 2. The Lord our God made a covenant with us at Horeb. It was not with our fathers that the Lord made this covenant, but with us, the living, every one of us who is here today, right? The emphasis here is that the covenant was not just with the people who were there, but with it is as if it's with every generation. I would say not merely with your fathers, but with everyone who is here today. Face to face, the Lord spoke to you on the mountain out of the fire. I stood between the Lord and you at the time to convey the Lord's words to you, for you were afraid of the fire and did not go up to the mountain. Right? So here, God is speaking, seems almost like God was there, but I don't think so. And now we get this version of the 10 Commandments. And now we're going to jump ahead to verse 1021, right after the 10 Commandments. And this is verse 19, page 1021. And so the Lord spoke these words, that is the 10 Commandments, these and no more, to your whole congregation at the mountain with a mighty voice out of the fire and dense clouds. He inscribed them on 2 tablets of stone, which he gave to me. When you heard the voice out of the darkness while the mountain was ablaze, you came to me, all your tribal heads and elders, and said, the Lord our God has shown his majestic presence, and we have heard his voice out of the fire. We have seen this day that man may live though God has spoken to him, let us not die then, for this fearsome fire will consume us. If we hear the voice of the Lord, our God, any longer, we will die. For what mortal has heard the voice of the living God speak out of the fire and lived? You go closer, hear all that the Lord our God says, and then tell us everything that the Lord our God tells you, and we will do it. And so that is really basic stuff that we find in Deuteronomy about this revelation. So before we move on to the Midrash, I'm going to open it again. Any questions about Deuteronomy or actually Exodus or anything about the Torah's vision here of what happens on Sinai? Okay, yeah, Barry.
This reading from Deuteronomy almost sounds as if the experience at Sinai was a one time only, and from then on, you're not going to be hearing the voice of God.
Yeah, and that's a really good point. And I'm trying to, the people as a whole will not hear God's voice. I want to put it that way because individuals will hear God's voice. The prophets hear God's voice, right? And they convey God's voice. Now, what does it mean to say that God, speaks to a prophet? Where do they hear it? How do they hear it? What does divine inspiration mean? And one could argue that they hear it in their minds.
I went back to sleep.
That it's not something that they hear through their ears. Here in Deuteronomy, they're certainly hearing it through their ears.
Give them all the.
And God's voice is thundering, and God's voice is overwhelming. And they're saying, no, you, you Moses, you listen, you convey God's words, right? It's too much for us. But there is a sense, at least to the people as a whole, right, that this is a one-time event.
Early, because it has to soak.
And that God's presence in this sense, in Exodus, is really extraordinary and not something that is.
Can you mute everybody, Rabbi? Can you mute everybody?
I'm sorry, can I mute everybody? Yes. Let me do that. I'd be glad to.
What about you?
Mute all. Okay. So if you do have any other questions, you can let me know, and then you'll have to unmute. All right. So what we're going to do now, and let me put this down again. What I want to do now is to talk about the Midrash. And I want to start by talking about what is actually, there are two kinds of Midrash. One is Midrash Halacha, right, which deals with Jewish law as such. And the other is Agadah, which are legends, traditions, which are based in the text in creative ways. So I want to start with a Midrash Halacha, which is the question of how one should behave when one is reading Torah, right? What does the Torah reader do? And the answer, according to the Jewish law, is the Torah reader must be standing. This is mentioned in the section of the Talmud about reading the Megillah, in which we're told that the reader of the Megillah on Purim can either stand or sit. And the Talmud goes on to say, unlike the reader from the Torah, who must be standing. Why? Because at one point, God says to Moses, stand here with me, right? And so the rabbis developed that in order to understand that the Torah reader has to be standing. Now, there's a tradition, an early Talmudic tradition, that everybody had to stand during the Torah reading. Now, this is a tradition rather than a law, right? But the tradition was that when the Torah is being, and the Talmud then asks, well, so why doesn't everybody stand? Because even in their day, it wasn't happening. And the answer is, well, since the time of Sinai, weakness has come into the world, right? Where people are no longer able to stand for the entire length of the Torah reading. Now, you might have seen this in some communities. There are people who will stand during the entire Torah reading. They sit down, as it were, in between the aliyot. Some of the Torah is read, and then while the person is saying the blessing, and the next person is being called up, and that person is saying, they'll sit down again, and then they'll stand up. Right. So this is a practical kind of midrashic teaching that comes from this story. Okay. Now, I mentioned to you, I sort of emphasized the fact that, at least in Deuteronomy, in Exodus, it says that people are tachtit hahar, at the base of the mountain. But if you take the text in Deuteronomy, literally, it says they are under the mountain. So this leads to a midrash which says God picked up Mount Sinai like a barrel and held it over the entire people of Israel and said, do you accept my Torah? If not, this is your grave, right? In other words, this is not, the image here is not God is giving the Torah and the people are willingly accepting it. It is being forced upon them, right? Now, there's another midrash which seems to run exactly in the other direction, which is that God went shopping the Torah to the other nations of the world. So God goes to the Amalekites and says, will you accept my Torah? And they say, what's in it? And God says, thou shalt not murder. And they say, sorry, can't do it. This is how we make our living, right? Because the Amalekites, after all, are this fierce, murderous group. And goes to another group and he says, we accept my Torah and what's in it, do not steal, sorry, right? Goes to another group, observe the Sabbath, and they said, look, we got to work, you can't do that, right? Only when God comes to the Israelites and says, would you like my Torah? And they essentially say, from you? Of course, right? They never read the contract. Moses is not a good lawyer. Moses doesn't say, make sure you read it before you sign it, right? None of that. In the Midrash, they are eager to accept it. And so we have really two contradictory Midrashim. Is it forced upon them or do they willingly accept it? And I want to say about Midrash in general, that while the rabbis are creating these fanciful kinds of explanations, and they're using, in some ways, the words of the Torah itself in which to base them, what they're really doing is grappling with other issues. And I would maintain that the issue here is that the Torah is forced upon us, and yet we have the ability to choose to accept it or not. What do I mean that it's forced upon us? If you're Jewish, right, and you're born of a Jewish mother in classical terms, you are bound to observe the Torah. Right? You don't get to choose, right? Right? I mean, you are, in classical terms, you are held accountable for these laws, whether you wanted to be or not, right? The mountain is over your head. right? You're compelled. On the other hand, the truth is you choose whether to accept it or not. Right? You can say no. We know that for a fact. There are lots of Jews who do, maybe most. So someone once said, well, we're all Jews by choice, especially if we don't live in a community, a closed community, which polices whether we do or do not follow the laws of the Torah, right? So I think that's what the rabbis are playing with, but they are locating it here in the giving of the Torah. Now, go ahead, Barry, unmute.
I think it did. So the second midrash seems to run counter to the notion of the Jewish people as chosen by God.
Yes, that's absolutely true. They are, in that midrash, they are the choosing people, right? Rather than the chosen people. The chosen people, though, understand is really contingent on choosing, right? God holds us accountable so that if the people do not choose, then they're going to be punished, right? But nonetheless, there is a sense that they choose or not choose, right? So I don't know that it really runs counter in that sense, at least in terms of the way the rabbis want to understand it. Okay, next, we have this scene now on the top of Mount Sinai. Moses goes up, and God is going to give him the Torah, and the angels start complaining. How can you take this sacred treasure, which existed 26 generations before the creation of the world, and give it to flesh and blood? That's the angels' argument, right? This is holy, it's sacred. These human beings, they're not perfect, not at all. How could you possibly give it to them, right? And God says to Moses, answer them. In other words, God says, defend your right, that is human beings' right, to this document, to this covenant. So it says that Moses then holds on to God's throne, right, trying to get some strength. And Moses then begins to engage the angels. And he says, what is written in the Torah? Honor your father and your mother. Do you have parents that you would honor? What is written in the Torah, right? Honor the Sabbath and keep it holy. Do you work that you need to rest? And goes through the 10 commandments, and the angels are persuaded, and Moses then receives the Torah, and the tablets are brought down to earth. Now, that midrash, I think, is really striking in that it's fundamentally anti-mystical, right? What is the Torah? It's not some mystical document that you could, and we're going to see another example, where a couple of more midrashim, where it's viewed as something very mystical, very holy. Remember that the tablets themselves are written by God, at least the first set, right? After Moses comes down in the golden calf and Moses smashes the tablets, then Moses is told, okay, you write them, right? And Moses writes them. But initially, it is Be'etzba Elohim, God's finger. Metaphorically, God is the one who engraves the tablet. So we get a sense of real holiness. But this midrash does not want to argue that. It doesn't at all. And it wants to say that the Torah is practical guidance for human beings. Now, we get something else, right, which sounds kind of mystical, and that is a midrash which asks the question, what is it that the people really heard. Because we saw in Deuteronomy that people are saying, no, no, you go, we don't want to hear, you'll tell us, right? So the most extreme position, what did the people actually hear? Only the first aleph of the first word of the 10 commandments, the aleph of Anochi, right? I, Anochi, right? I am the Lord your God. What is the sound of an aleph? Doesn't have any sound. So what is the experience of the people? Right? They're trembling. What do they hear? They hear the shofar. There is another explanation that really all they hear are the first 3 commandments. And this is rather clever because the first 3 commandments are in the first person. I am the Lord your God who brought, you shall have no gods before me, right? But when you get to the rest of the commandments, then you get references to God in the, for the Lord, right, is a jealous God. Not I, the Lord, right? So that sounds like someone talking about God rather than God speaking. So that's the basis of that midrash. But perhaps the most mystical midrash, again, Moses is on top of Mount Sinai. And he is waiting now for God to give the Torah. You almost have this image that he's drumming his fingers. God at this moment is busy putting the finishing touches on this tablet. And specifically, what he's doing, what God is doing, is inscribing the letters, including the crowns on the letters, right? If you look at a Torah scroll, there's such a thing as Torah script, and some of the letters have these little crowns on them, the letter Shin, for example. So Moses is like, what do you need that for? It's clear, right? And God's response is not, well, it looks nice, right? God says, there will arise at the end of days, not the end, but later on in future times, a man named Akiva, Rabbi Akiva, and from these crowns, he will derive myriads of laws. And Moses then says, let me see him. And he is magically transported to the yeshiva where Rabbi Akiva is teaching. And he sits down in the back, and Akiva is teaching, and Moses gets really upset because he does not understand what Akiva is teaching. It's beyond him, right? But finally, one of Akiva's students asks, where does this come from, this law? And Akiva says, it's halacha l'Moshe Sinai. This is a law that was transmitted to us by Moses from Sinai. And so Moses feels better. Now, by the way, the story goes, it takes a very dark turn. And this really, is, I think, a powerful statement of theology. Moses says, I have seen his teaching. Let me see his reward. And God says, turn around, and Moses turns around, and Akiva is being tortured and killed by the Romans. And Moses says, this is his Torah, and this is his reward. And God says, silence, that is my decree. Right? Really shocking and difficult. Right? And the rabbis are very honestly, I think, raising this question of theodicy, right, which they can't resolve. Right? How could this be? Moses sort of, in some sense, intoning the rabbinic view. So here, I mean, there's a lot to say about this particular midrash, but one thing one can say about it is that this is a very mystical view of Torah, right? Encoded in the Torah, or it's not just honor your father and your mother, it's not just keep my Sabbaths, right? Or don't steal. Every letter is packed. What, Rabbi Akiva is going to be able to unravel the deeper meanings of the Torah, right? There's another midrash that the Torah is written in black fire on white fire, right? That this is a holy mystical document, at least the one that we receive on Sinai the first time. The second tablets are stone, right? Not written by the hand of God, but written by Moses. All right, so we have the rabbis' kind of two different views. And by the way, those two views represent two different schools of rabbinic thought. One was championed by Akiva, and the other was championed by a rabbi by the name of Yishmael. Right? Akiva said that the Torah speaks in the language of God. Right? Every letter is significant. And for Ishmael, the Torah speaks in human language. God is conveying what human beings need and what they hear, and there's nothing more to it than that, right? So here in the Midrash, where we have an attempt to figure out what's going on Sinai, we also have really different values. The Midrash about Moses not understanding what Akiva is teaching is very important for the conservative movement. Because what it suggests, right, is that each generation adds something new, that in some ways it's inherent in the Torah, but in other ways it's really novel, right? And that's appropriate, right? So that the Torah is not something static, which is given, but it is something which will be interpreted and understood differently in each generation. And that seems to be what that midrash is saying. Okay, so there are many other midrashim, but I wanted to share at least some of them with you. And I'm opening it up now again for comment, and I can actually, what I'll do at this point is to, well, I can't unmute you all, so you'll unmute yourselves. I'm really interested to hear both, any questions you have, and also anything that might have struck you. Hannah, go ahead. You can start.
Yeah, was Horeb an area? It's not on any maps now at all, right? We just don't know anything about it.
Right, but Sinai's not on a map now either.
Right.
We don't know where Sinai was. This is simply an alternative name. Now, modern scholars, some of them will suggest, well, we just have different traditions, right? And the Torah blends these different traditions. But what's in common among them is that Moses goes up to the top of a mountain, that God delivers the Torah to Moses. That is consistent. I would remind you also that Moses's father-in-law, Jethro, has a bunch of different names, right? So the Torah does that. I don't know more what to say about it than that. Marilyn.
Do generations of rabbis reinterpret the Torah that was given on Mount Sinai?
Yes. Yeah, and that is really the point, I think. I don't know what that is. That's the point of that midrash, absolutely. And, so there's another view, which is called Nit Katnu Hadorot, which is the shrinking of the generations, right? Which is to say, if you're at Sinai, you're getting the real thing because you were there. And then each generation, it's like a game of telephone, right? It gets more and more garbled. Another way of looking at that, this idea is they were giants, the previous generations, and we are midgets by comparison. They could be creative. I would remind you, for example, that there were times, capital punishment, right, where the rabbis effectively limited to such an extent it almost doesn't exist. But in the Torah itself, it seems to be pretty clear that if you kill somebody, you're going to get killed unless it's accidental, right? So those rabbis who did that were giants, but we can't do that. We're midgets. We don't have that standing. They're closer to Sinai than we are. The classic answer to that, by the way, is we are midgets, but we stand on the shoulders of giants. It's a different way of looking at it. But yeah, I think the point of the Midrash about Moses and another famous Midrash, which I'll mention very quickly. There's a dispute between two rabbis about actually whether an oven is kosher if one of its bricks has become defiled, and they go back and forth. And one of the rabbis induces all kinds of proofs, which are not Torah proofs, but he says, well, if I'm right, let that river flow backwards, and it flows backwards. He says, if I'm right, let that tree jump out of its place and go over there, and it does. If I'm right, let the walls of the study hall collapse. They almost do until one of the other rabbis stops them. And finally, he says, if I'm right, let God tell us, right? Or let it come from heaven. And in the heavens, we hear this voice. It's called the bat kol, the daughter of a voice, clearly speaking for God. It says, no, he's right. Right? Yeah, his view is correct. And the other rabbis, who are the majority, reject it. Right? And they say, lo bashamayim. They quote a verse from Deuteronomy, it is not in heaven. Meaning what? Meaning you gave us the Torah, and now it's up to us to decide what it means. Right? Another very powerful midrash, which suggests the ongoing development, right, of Torah and the legitimacy of that ongoing. By the way, that midrash, my children have defeated me, so it goes on to say that some rabbi runs into Elijah the prophet, happens to see him, because remember that Elijah, according to the rabbinic tradition, comes down and visits the earth from time to time. That's why we open the door for him, Pesach, right? He might come in, right? So they say, this rabbi says, what was God doing when they said, lo bashamayim, it's not in heaven, and rejected this divine voice? And the answer, Elijah says, is God laughed. And he said, my children have defeated me. Wow. Right. Okay. Any other questions?
I have one.
Yeah, go ahead.
So
Brenda.
this is something, I don't remember did you say it, did Rabbi Tobin say it, something about, they thought that there was an interpretation somewhere that the commandment about honoring the parents, that the mother comes before the father.
Yes.
Because
So,
we give
right.
life. And
no, it's not. It's not.
also, sometimes it said father and mother. So I'm curious
Right. So,
what you know about that.
So there are two versions, right? Well, it says, honor your father and your mother, kaved et avicha, honor your father and mother. But there's another language which says you should, often translated as fear them, right? Or reverence them in a certain way. And so the one midrashic explanation is you honor your father first because it's more natural to honor your mother, right? So, there's the kind of loving relationship, whereas the father is more stern. Now, whether that's true or not, these
And there's
are
always Disney Dad.
right? And conversely, you might view your mother as kind of a soft touch, and you don't really have that sense of yirah, awe, fear. So she comes first in that formulation. And the rabbis, by the way, then begin to ask the question, well, what does it actually mean to honor your mother or father? And what does it mean to have reverence or fear or awe of them? And they develop that really at great length, which is well beyond what we have time for. Anything else? Yeah, Barry, go ahead.
Mostly an observation, but there are many different English versions of the Torah, the Bible. And I often come across as someone who reads the Hebrew and says, well, despite what the English translation says, that's not what the Hebrew says.
Yes, yeah. So that is.
But so, is there
Right.
some more definitive? What's the most definitive
Well,
source?
so
If there is
it's
one?
certainly true. Somebody once said that every translation is an interpretation, right? You're making choices. And I like to read lots of different translations for that reason, right? I also can read the Hebrew, but not always. And sometimes the Hebrew is strange, unexpected. So it's interesting to see how it's translated. I'll give you one really quick example of how important translation is, and that is the opening words of the Torah. Right? Often we think of it as, in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. Okay? That means what? That nothing existed before. Right? It was the first thing in the beginning. But actually, there's another way of translating it, which is Rashi's way, and it's generally been accepted. And that is, when God began to create the heavens and the earth was unformed and void. In other words, other things could have happened before. But when God began to create heaven and earth, that's not the beginning, right? It's not the Big Bang, to use a modern metaphor, right? But when God got around to the heaven and the earth, right? So translation is critical there, right? Because it's a very different conception of the universe. Somebody also once said that reading Torah in translation is like kissing your beloved through a veil. Another, I think, very poetic way of looking at it. So it's and even more, to make things even more complicated, words change meanings over time, right? So even the Hebrew might have meant something different to an earlier generation, perhaps, than what it means to us. And certainly that's true in translation. One of the things that the Torah mentions in the King James, it mentions corn. Now, how could that be? Corn is a New World product, right? So how, could it be that the Torah is referring in the land of Israel to corn? Well, the truth is that the word corn meant something different in English. There were different kinds of corn. Right? Barley corn was barley. In other words, the word corn really meant grain. And there would be a modified. What we call corn is not what the Elizabethans called corn, right? So it's very complicated. Anything else, anybody? Well, it's been a pleasure. I hope you feel excited about Shavuot and the giving of the Torah. Next week, which will be our last session before a significant break, I want to teach the book of Ruth. It is a book that I've taught this, and some of you have probably studied it with me because I've taught it a lot on the weeks before Shavuot. But every time I prepare and every time I teach it, I tend to find new things. So it's a very short book, but it's certainly for me one of the most beautiful in the Bible. So I'm going to look at that next week. And I hope you'll come back, and I will, God willing, see you then. So
Have a good week.
Have a good week. Thank
Have a
you.
good week. Thank
yes,
you.
you all, please have a good week as well. And let me bye now.